Hello, and welcome to the Humanistic Counseling, a podcast in which we discuss, analyze, critique, and celebrate both well-established and cutting-edge ideas across the field of humanistic counseling. I'm Brett Wilkinson, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, otherwise known as JHC. I'd like to welcome Dr. Elyssa B. Smith, founder of the Inner Canvas Collective, a private practice outside of Philadelphia. Dr. Smith is a licensed professional counselor, approved clinical supervisor, registered play therapist supervisor, and scholar. She has completed advanced postgraduate training at the Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis and is also certified in mindfulness-based play family therapy. Before launching private practice, she served as tenure-track faculty in a graduate counseling program and provided play therapy to children and families in schools, community centers, and hospitalization programs. In today's interview, we'll discuss her 2019 JHC qualitative research article entitled Holding the Tension of Opposites, Counselors' Experiences of the Therapeutic Internalization Process. Dr. Smith, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
In the article, you explore how authentic relationships can lead us counselors to internalize aspects of a client, sometimes in ways that meaningfully shape our own lives. You discuss how Freud's approach to internalization was influenced by Nietzsche, who wrote, quote, "All instincts that are not allowed free play turn inward. This is what I call interiorization. It alone provides the soil for the growth of what later is called soul." To start, can you explain this concept of internalization as you define it in your study and how it relates to the phenomenon of, quote, intercession experiences?
Yeah, so the concept of internalization is a very complex one. I think I'll start by talking about it broadly, and then I can go into how I defined it and conceptualizing and talking about it in this study in particular. So, internalization is a concept that's grounded in the psychodynamic and attachment literature, and it's basically the idea that as human beings, our earliest interactions involve relationships with others, and that these become taken in and form and are templates for how we regulate, understand, and direct our views of self and others within these interpersonal relationships. So then, when we're taking that out to the therapeutic relationship or the counseling relationship, it's this idea that when we have authentic and meaningful relationships with our clients, that there are pieces that both of us take with us outside of session. So there are things that happen in between or outside of the actual time that we're in the therapy room together. So this could look like, and is often described by clients or patients, like hearing their therapist's voice in their head when they have some trouble going on in their life. And the therapist could possibly, if we're looking from the therapist, then could maybe see something that reminded them of their client and just think about something about them in general. So it's this idea of holding pieces of our clients and or therapists on the other end, and having something come up for us that isn't occurring in the counseling room. And there is a related concept called intercession experiences, which is based on this research that was, I think it's Dutch, or that it's from somewhere in Europe that they did, which is basically, and I'm going to read the quote. There was a bunch of research done, and this was more focused on the therapist end, but all the spontaneous and intentional thoughts, memories, feelings, fantasies that the client and the therapist have about their therapy and one another during the time between or outside of therapy sessions. So, again, this idea that things that we're thinking and feeling about one another and about therapy are not happening in the room itself.
Okay. And so you look at the fact that we have this experience of internalization and that as a therapist, as a counselor, in between sessions, we can have an experience of thinking about the client, and clients can do the same. And how do you view this idea of internalization? What makes this important for us as counselors?
I think it's important for us to acknowledge that clients do have an impact on our lives and that they do touch us in certain ways, and that it is inevitable part of the process, especially if you're having a meaningful and deep, intimate connection with someone, that as a human being, you're going to naturally have these experiences. And I find sometimes, or more in the past, there's been some taboos around that. Like, is that a boundary violation? Should we just, compartmentalize and just shut it out and not be able to, are we capable, and is it a realistic expectation? And so my idea and notion is that instead of thinking about it as good or bad, rather just considering it as is, because it's inevitable. And so my study was really to try and find out more about what this looks like from the therapist's end, because it's not talked about as much or considered, but is a very important part of, I think, training and supervision and our ability to have positive outcomes with our clients as well in treatment.
So, to explore this further, you conducted a study, a narrative inquiry, and that
Hmm.
narrative inquiry revealed three major categories that speak to how counselors experience internalization. And those three were holding the tension of opposites, transporting back, and uncertainty. Can you explain these in a bit further detail for listeners?
Yeah, so really the holding the tension of opposites piece was one. So these are threads, and I guess to contextualize it a little bit more, that a thread is something that goes throughout the entire narrative inquiry process, and is connected to the other threads, but stands on its own. So it's interwoven across. So it's less that these are categories, but really this was spoken about by each of the people that I interviewed in various ways. So the first one to explain is called Holding the Tension of Opposites, that really is about this idea that we want to form these deep connections with our clients, and it's a really special and powerful experience. But there's also boundaries, or the ability to have some separation at the same time. So there's this tension that comes up and that came up for the participants around this idea of being pulled towards wanting to deepen these connections, but also knowing that boundaries are important and that there needs to be some kind of separation involved in the process.
Okay. And so that's the holding the tensions of opposites. What about
Mhm.
transporting back?
So this was more about the participants talked about, there were certain like spaces or contexts or events that really sparked this notion of internalization for them, or that they had some connection to their clients outside of session, and that um, it kind of came through reminders. So seeing things, or kind of sparked memories of, and they were kind of brought back into the time or the thing that they were holding, that was happening for them as they experienced the taking in of the client and that impact on them.
So, in the first one, the holding the tension of opposites, the counselor experiences internalization as a dialectic, a tension
Hmm.
between desire for connection and then this other part of themselves that speaks to the professional need to create separation. And so
Hmm.
they experience the internalization as that form of tension. The other experience of internalization is about being drawn back into the memory of contact, right,
Hmm.
in a phenomenological way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then
and
go ahead.
re-experiencing that, kind of re-experiencing that when they see that, or they're sort of sets off their movement back into that time and space.
Yes. So the transport back, it is very much
Mm-hmm.
a phenomenologically, it is very much a movement back into the experience itself.
Mm-hmm.
And
Hmm.
then the third one is uncertainty. Can you speak to this one a bit?
Yeah, so this I think kind of intertwines, like I said, these all intertwine with one another, but is related to that tension. I think it is this idea that this experience is very intense, and can also be something that is about uncertainty. So this like thing about who they're becoming and who they are as
Hmm.
counselors in different contexts isn't fixed, and that this experience kind of speaks to that or mirrors that um, if their past experiences have influenced their present work and identity as counselors and their experience of taking in clients, they then bring with them into the work they do in the future. And it also helps them know themselves better. And so it was sort of this idea of um, being a counselor is dealing with tensions, is tolerating ambiguity, is continuing to evolve. And there is a true impact that working with clients have on your identity and also your growth as a person, and how that evolves and is shaped over time through these connections, through these relationships, and that then is brought into the next one, or your work as you evolve as a counselor.
And I'm glad you brought up this term ambiguity, because that's part of what, as I read the article, that really comes up heavily for me, is that
Hmm.
these counselors, and through the threads that you highlight, there is a engagement with ambiguity that demonstrates how a deep and meaningful therapeutic relationship um, blurs the lines between objectivity and the objective counselor as professional, and the subjective experience that we have of needing others in order to understand ourselves in the world.
For
And
sure,
so
yes.
each one of these three seems to point to that in a particularly unique way, or with a particular light. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of that, we learn about ourselves through relationships with others, and that can be applied or is applied to being a counselor and the work we do, and how deep and intimate and meaningful and powerful our therapeutic relationships are, and how they shape both us and the client.
Great. And speaking of learning, what are the implications beyond this? We're touching into this kind of fluidly. The implications for counselors. I think you'd probably like to address this in terms of countertransference, self-care, and what it means to be a mental health professional. If you like to continue this thread of thought, and what do you think about those areas for implications?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of implications for this on a larger level and also directly related to the study itself. So I think these experiences are unique to the individuals that I interviewed, but I also think they provide something for us to consider. So it gives us a space to think about what their experiences were and see how that fits for us contextually as counselors. So I think, that is what qualitative research is, right? Your job is to be able to contextualize and use the information in the way that works for you. But I think it gives us a way to speak about these things. It gives us a way to acknowledge that they exist. And then also just, some encouragement about how, if it's professional, it can be a powerful thing, and that it can lead to better outcomes for both you and the person you're working with. So instead of trying to pretend or be thinking it's taboo, I think leaning into it is really important. And that's what I took out of this study when I originally did it. And I think as I evolve as a person and as a counselor, it's become something that I'm very passionate about continuing to talk about and help um, people understand. But if we break it down into particular areas, I think for education and training, for counselors in training, when you're learning how to become a counselor, even your early years, like if you're an associate counselor under supervision, that the personal is significant. So we need to be having conversations and creating climates where we can talk about things that touch upon us, and this delicate balance between our desire to be close, but also to have some departure from our clients in a professional way, and that this can be both a strength and a boundary concern. So being able to create spaces where we can discuss this dialectic, where we can hold space for both, where it comes through as a way to just invite deeper and more difficult conversations. Because when we do counseling, like, we're the tool, right? if you go to a medical doctor, let's say this is just an example I have in my head. If you go to a medical doctor, they have other tools that can support them. Yes, they need to, who the doctor is important, but they can do x-rays, or they can take your blood work, and that helps them determine what's going on and helps with the treatment process, or they can prescribe medication or give you something that is helpful to your eventual cure outcome. But in counseling, we're the tool. It's us, right? We're showing up, and the more that we show up as ourselves in a professional way is how we have positive outcomes. So this is so important to acknowledge that, like, we're it. It's just us. We have to bring ourselves in a professional way. And so having these conversations and creating climates where they're welcome and explored is so vital to the education and training process. That is something that I feel strongly about in general. And then I don't know if you want to say anything in response, and then
No,
I'll.
no, please go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And then with supervision, I think supervision is such a beautiful place to talk about these things because parallel process happens, and we can kind of bring it in the room, and the supervisor and the supervisee can kind of not only talk about it but really in vivo experience the feeling and what's going on. And so it's such a unique space to have these kind of more relational and felt experiences. So
Hmm.
I think welcoming that in supervision is such an important thing to capitalize on, and I try to do that whenever I supervise and with my supervisees. So having conversations about countertransference, and then also bringing it up with parallel process and this idea of how it can be relived in with the supervisor and supervisee, and that in turn really does help the supervisee to be able to bring that back into their work with clients, because if they can process and learn about themselves like we were talking about, then they can do that for someone else too. And so it's such a I love supervision because of that. It's such a powerful thing in that way, and is unique to that experience. But yeah, also in supervision, we have to obviously speak to how this balance is imperative, and if clients are touching upon us too much,
Hmm.
because there are situations, where someone could have be experience vicarious trauma or have something really intense come up for them, and if
Hmm.
it is really blurring the lines or something that needs to be addressed, we need to also be professional and ethical around that. So, really paying attention to those, not forgetting about those ethical concerns and those boundary violations that might come up so that we can address them and support um, people in doing that. And then in clinical practice, I think that a group supervision or a work-based consultation group is nice for
Hmm.
this, speaking about these things, because it's peer-to-peer, and there's a lot of research, and also just from my own experiences at witnessing my students and supervisees, that being with your peers is a little bit more comfortable, or they
Hmm.
you feel like they get it. And so it's more just kind of talking out loud with someone else and being able to discuss things with people who get it. And so it's I think, a nice space to welcome these conversations. And that we need to continue our own supervision and personal counseling. Um, and that this is something for clinical practice, like I was saying earlier, that can potentially benefit both the therapist and the client. Um, so yeah, those are really the most. There's more, but that's I'll stop there for implications. I think there's a lot
I think
in
that's a
general.
fantastic overview. That's a very important overview, and I thank you for going into all those details. For our final question, what do you think is particularly important about humanistic counseling?
Well, I think nowadays there's technology and there's all of these things going on with social media, and there's all these messages that come at us, and we are consumed by not being present with people. And so I feel like humanism is always and will always value that ability to be with, that presence, that importance of relationships, and being authentic too, like, because like I was saying, there's so much noise, there's so many people nowadays telling you what to do, what to think, what to feel. And so how can we really quiet that noise and listen to ourselves and show up authentically? I think is becoming a different kind of challenge in today's society. And so I'm always encouraged by going back to humanism and this idea that how we have such meaningful relationships, how we show up authentically is really how we continue to learn about ourselves and others. And so being able to be aware of maybe the tensions, going back to the article about how that might be harder in today's society, but how it's really important to listen to our inner voice and figure out what we really want in an authentic way.
I agree. Dr. Smith, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And many thanks to you, good listeners, for spending time with us here at the Humanistic Counselor Podcast. All JHC articles can be accessed through the Wiley Online Library. If you're a member of the Association for Humanistic Counseling, then you get free access to this article and many, many others through the American Counseling Association website at www.counseling.org. If you'd like to become a member of AHC, then we hope you'll visit our website at www.humanisticcounseling.org. Thank you, be well, and hope to see you here next time on the Humanistic Counselor Podcast.